Hello, Year 12. Welcome to the White Void. Oh, after the announcement last night, we know that we're doing remote learning until at least the Easter half term, and we know that this year there won't be any exams. I guess that doesn't really help you guys at all or much because, well, you already had that in Year 11, and you're in Year 12 now, so your exams are next year. They'll be next year, but 2023. So anyway, we've done families and households now. I've now finally managed to mark all your essays if you're in my set. If you're in Miss Wibbly's set, I haven't marked any of your essays, I'm sorry. There will be another essay set shortly. That will be the homework from this week. But this lesson will be the start of the new part of the course. So for 3 lessons a week, the equivalent, we're going to be looking at research methods, which, I don't know, considering what we're looking at and considering what's just happened, could be quite interesting. How do people get data? And, well, I don't know about you, I'm actually quite excited because I quite like making videos. I don't know how many of you will know that. However, I do have really bad YouTube etiquette, which means that when I'm looking for something, I will look down at the keyboard rather than at the screen, which it's just bad. It's just bad. I mean, I can't edit. Anyway, this research methods. See, check it out. I'm very proud of my background. It's brand new. I've not made this before. Usually I rely on standing in front of a whiteboard and prancing around like a loon. But today I'm making something new. So what is, there we go, what is research methods? What are we talking about? Well, many sociological questions rely on concepts and ideas that people assume they know all about and can define easily. Consider at the beginning of the year when I asked my set, and I think Miss Wibbly asked hers, about what class you came from, as in middle class, working class, or upper class. And it's all very well that you all said middle class, and in many ways you are right. But what does that mean? Now, for many of you, that meant something very particular. And for one of you, I remember, yes, Max, I haven't forgotten, you said you were working class. But what does that mean? We've kind of got an idea about that through families and households, and we kind of know what we mean by those terms. But you ask the general public, and they will have a very different response for you. And that's because most of the questions that sociologists ask, as you've become aware, are ones that everyone thinks they already know the answer to. And that's pretty problematic because, well, there's a lot of noise created there. There's a lot of people who assume they know the answer to questions when actually they don't. Or the questions might have different answers depending on who's doing the looking. So how do we gain the data we need when we're sociologists? Well, that's research methods. That's how we find out what we need to know. And that's the subject of this intro. It is no more than an intro. Were it a lesson, we'd go a little bit further if I had something to bounce off. But this is a video lesson, so I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. So let's go through. Here are some basics about what data is. There are different types of data. Data, by the way, is the plural. Datum is the singular. You know how much I love my Latin. So data and datum. Data. There are 2 types of data, 2 ways in which we can look at data. There is primary data and there is secondary data. Sounds like a history lesson, doesn't it? And to make things worse, sociologists talk about sources of data, which get shortened to sources. Sorry, I'm getting flashbacks to history lessons. But anyway, primary data is data collected by sociologists themselves. It's stuff that when you're trying to answer sociological questions, we go out, we ask the questions, we find out what we need to know, we collect the data, we write down the data, and we mine that data for various information. So in this case, primary data is not the same as historical data when we talk about primary data in history. This is sociological data. Primary means collected by the researcher themselves. And the sorts of things that you can do as a sociologist are social surveys, for example. We can do participant observation. That's a fun one. We can do experiments. And we can use all of those and they will be primary data. I mean, questionnaires count. My favorite are questionnaires. I really like questionnaires. I'm a very sad individual. Secondary data, therefore, if primary data is collected by the sociologists themselves, the research themselves, us, if you will, is data collected by anybody else, basically. that is then used by sociologists to answer sociological questions. And this can include things like official statistics, like ONS data, the Office for National Statistics, which is kind of important when we're talking about, I don't know, births, marriages, and deaths related to COVID, for example. The ONS data was different to the government data back in March and April and May. Don't know if you're aware of that. The ONS data usually lags by a couple of weeks behind whatever the headline data is. Various news outlets will adjust that data according to the ONS statistics, but they weren't doing back in April, which meant that the government were able to claim we never had above 1,000 deaths a day, except that we did. That's what the ONS discovered later. And that's interesting. And that can have an effect. Furthermore, there are documents, things like letters and newspapers. Newspapers are particularly interesting, but documents, weirdly, also includes new media. To you and me, that's our lifeblood, it's the internet, and I live on the internet, all my friends are there. So those are the two types of data, primary and secondary. What kind of questions can you use? Can you use this data to answer? So, for example, there's been a lot of talk on the news lately about whether or not people are following the rules. Now, anecdotally, people will say, oh, I know lots of people are not following the rules. They'll always say that they are themselves and that they're keeping track of those that don't. And I find that fascinating. And they'll say, oh, well, you know, there's lots of reasons why. But the thing is, what is compliance to the rules actually like? Well, all the major studies seem to suggest it's actually quite high. And the high profile and very obvious breaking of those rules doesn't seem to change that. So this chimera that people aren't following the rules is a chimera. It's fantasy. It's not really true. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the questions that seem to have easy answers, but actually don't. The second way of looking at data is data type. So we've said there's primary data collected by sociologists and the secondary data that sociologists use is collected by other people. There's also quantitative data. That's my favorite. It's numerical data, stats, charts, and graphs. You know how much I love my charts and graphs and numerical data. Things like GCSE league tables, for example, which will be interesting this year. Again, births, marriages, and deaths related to COVID. And then there is qualitative data. And that is the feels, if you will. So when you ask someone, what does it feel like to get good GCSE grades? How is that different to getting bad GCSE grades? What counts as a good GCSE grade in your book? What does that mean? And also, for example, there was a death in the family. How did that affect the family? Consider the life in lockdown thing that I showed you before Christmas. By that fellow from The Guardian, whose name has utterly escaped me again. And what you were looking at there was what we call qualitative data. He was talking to people about what it meant to be under various levels of restriction, rather than just the raw numbers. The map, for example, that you can look up on the internet of which areas are under which tier, or I suppose when there were different tiers, you could look at that and work out the quantitative data. But the qualitative data, what did it mean in those areas, relied on interviews and discussions and participant observation in many ways. So quantitative and qualitative data do different things. And it depends what you're aiming for as to what you use. Now, handily, there is a chart that you can use for this. There it is. Don't worry, this is attached to the Show My Homework. If you've seen the video first for whatever reason, don't worry, it's all on Show My Homework. Do go through it. I've layered it, sorry, it's difficult to print, but it's relatively easy to navigate. So primary data can be quantitative in terms of questionnaires. Sociologists can send out a particular form of questionnaire, and I do love questionnaires. They can do structured interviews where they have a set series of questions that then they go through. They have a script they follow, and the respondent can respond to those because it can be face-to-face with 2 meters distance in current situations. Primary qualitative data that offers a bit more in depth, and you can turn on a sixpence and you can find out what people really mean. You can then follow up areas of inquiry. We talked about this when we're talking about postmodernists. So if you remember, Stacey with the divorce extended family was a good example of what you can find that you might not be looking for in the first place. The divorce extended family, that is a network of females working together to support one another financially and socially, would not have been discoverable through mere quantitative data. Had she just relied on questionnaires and structured interviews and official statistics, she would not have been able to discover anything about that particular form of family. Now, it doesn't mean that that form of family is important. It was only ever there as an illustration of what you can discover when you're looking for things on a postmodernist viewpoint. So qualitative data can include participant observation, whereby, I don't know, you want to know what it feels like to be on strike? Well, join a bunch of strikers, join them on the picket line, have a couple of words with them, find out what people are talking about, take recordings of the conversation, jot down impressions of what it felt like. I've taken part in 2 strikes now. One a national strike and one a local strike. And they were very different animals. They were very different feelings. And I guess I haven't mentioned that I'm autistic yet. So here is the traditional mention that I'm an autistic person. I was there as a participant observer. I learned how people were responding because I don't know how to respond to these things. And the second one is unstructured interviews. So that when you get oh, that's an interesting answer, you can then drill down into it. Secondary quantitative data will be things like official stats, one of my favorites, opinion polls, what do you think of X? And then you look at the data that's created by that, various charts and figures. Qualitative data will be things like letters between loved ones. I guess emails count these days. Snapchats? Do Snapchats count? I'm not really sure what the Snapchatting is at the moment, or the WhatsApping, or whatever things you use. Rust? Is Rust an app or a game? I don't know. Solo Rust? I don't know. I'm not down with the kids. And online articles, newspapers, those sorts of things. So there are the separation, if you will, between quantitative and qualitative, primary and secondary data. So how do you choose what method you're going to use if you're going to use any of these methods? Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. I meant to hit pause, and I don't know if you noticed that, but that meant the screen froze, and then I sort of continued to look vaguely at the keyboard because I am that rubbish. Anyway, how do you choose the methods? What are the factors? And it's all about, well, there are 3 ways. There are practical issues that face us first. And these can be broken down into the following areas. There's time and money, first and foremost. Basically, if you're going to do a large-scale survey, if you're going to do a huge amount of questionnaires, that costs you in terms of staff to run those sorts of things. And then to get the answers in and to collate the data and to turn it into quantitative data and to turn it into something you can actually use. And that's costly. It takes a lot of money. You can do it quickly, but it's expensive. And not every researcher has the money to throw at their problem. So, for example, if I wanted to find out how people were going to vote in the next election in, say, just Duffield, I could throw a lot of money at the problem and probably get a decent answer. But I don't have that money. I'm a teacher in a school. I don't have amounts of money to throw at the problem. I could, if I wished, do it smaller scale and just do it me, and then, I don't know, just ask the students that I was teaching what they thought their parents were going to do. My answers wouldn't be as good or insightful, but it would be a darn sight cheaper. Alternatively, I could want to find out what happened to a bunch of students over time in education, for example. So I could pick a group of year 7s and I could regularly check in with them and find out what they were doing, gather various quantitative data. But if I wanted to find out how school affected them from the moment they entered to, say, their exam prospects at university, I'd have to follow them for a good, 9 to 10 years? That's a long time. That's an incredible chunk of life I'd have to throw at that. That's nearly the age of my middlest child. So, there's time to be invested. So it could be money or it could be time. And not everyone has that amount of time. Not everyone's boring like me. Requirements. If you are lucky enough to get the funding from various agencies, they'll have particular questions they want to answer. And the type of method you will choose has to generate the kind of data they need. So if they're asking how people are going to vote, what you really need is quantitative data and a large sample size and a fairly reliable cross-section of society. And so you'd have to do, a scripted questionnaire. You couldn't just randomly walk out onto the street in a bunch of areas and ask everyone you found. That wouldn't be representative. It wouldn't be terribly helpful. And it wouldn't generate the data that you'd be able to legitimately give given the requirements of the funding you receive. Does that make sense? So you've got to make sure the data matches what you're trying to find out. That doesn't mean you go out with confirmational bias and you have an idea that you want to find and prove, so therefore you ignore data to the contrary. It means that you've got to find the right data to answer the question, if that makes sense. There's also personal skills and characteristics. A lot of researchers have particular confirmation biases anyway, and particular things they're good at and things that they worry about. So, for example, were I a researcher, I have an affinity with numbers and charts and data and graphs, as you know. One thing I'm less enamored with is the idea of in-depth interviews. I get very uncomfortable very quickly, and I'd probably make you guys uncomfortable too. I don't have that kind of rapport. Observations, participant observations, absolutely, sign me up, because I am used to just watching and fading into the background. Might be a surprise. This background is particularly white though, and empty. It's game recognizing game. So yeah, sociologists are people too, and they come with skills and achievements and abilities that others don't. And a lot of the time that will affect by what methods you use anyway. There's also subject matter. So for example, participant observation, I've already said I'd enjoy it, but if I wanted to learn about, I don't know, a feminist group made up entirely of females, short of disguising myself heavily, I'm not sure I could really get away with a participant observation. I don't think that's going to work terribly well. And indeed, if I wanted to learn what the opinions of less literate people were, a well-written questionnaire ain't going to work because they're less literate. They can't read it. So, or at least they can't read for the meaning that I'd want them to get. Do you see what I mean? So sometimes your methods have to be adapted to what you're trying to find out about and the groups you're trying to investigate. You want to learn about people affected by COVID deaths. It's probably not a good idea to go in a high energy YouTube style. Hey, ain't going to work very well with people who are mourning. Do you see what I mean? Also, opportunity. Sometimes opportunities arrive unexpectedly. Famously, in the textbook, this is where I nicked the idea, a bloke called Patrick in 1973 was basically offered the chance to join a Glaswegian gang as an observer. So he did. He had no time to prepare for it. He had to just sort of quickly go and get the information he wanted. Or there was a case of a doctoral thesis student who well, basically did his back in and got severe backache and ended up having to undertake a study and took the opportunity to be a participant observer in a hospital because he'd done his back in. Do you see what I mean? These can be unexpected. But equally, there are other things that sociologists look forward to because they know it's coming. For example, census returns. We know there'll be a census this year. And so sociologists can prepare very much in advance and know that the opportunity is coming, but they also know there's a limitation to the data. So it's not going to tell them everything they want to know, but they can use what they know is going to be asked to work out other questions they can ask in advance, allowing them to work out what they can get, if that makes sense, and what questions can be answered. So opportunity works both ways. It can be unexpected, you can't prepare for it, or you know an opportunity is coming in the future and you get a chance to prepare for that accordingly. So that's practical. The second is ethical. Ethical is trying to make sure that you stay morally correct. Now, we talked about this already. I said that sociology doesn't offer moral answers to questions, but in how we gain the answers to those questions, it does offer moral quandaries that sociologists would do well to keep in mind and try and work their way around. So first of all, there's this concept of informed consent. After all, people who are being studied can choose not to be studied. Maybe they don't want someone prying into that particular area of their lives, or indeed anyone prying, full stop. Also, that means you've got to provide the information to the people you're going to study about what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, so that they can make an informed decision. If you just say, I'm looking at sexuality, would you like to be interviewed? A lot of people are going to say no. And the people that say yes won't necessarily be the people you need for your study. This is shown by online surveys. Online surveys where you've got to give personal information tend to show the population to be very, very conservative, small c, in their opinions about sexuality. If you put an anonymous survey on there, well, then you get a lot more people who are less conservative. Now, are either of those correct? No, they're not. But the type of informed consent questionnaires out there that tell you what they're looking for and why they're doing it, when we're talking about sexuality, don't take this. But there are online tests out there. I'm not going to name tests. You'll go and look them up and then take them. So I'm not going to name it. Sorry. But there are tests out there you can take. I am a great believer in questionnaires. I went through a stage of answering every questionnaire I could possibly. I didn't answer those. I could possibly find. There used to be a site that aggregated them. It was amazing. Any chance to skew statistics. But if you tell people what you're looking for and why you're looking for it and what data you're going to require, and you reassure people that they're going to be looked after, people are reasonably good at coming forward with the data you need. And that's why informed consent is useful. Furthermore, if you're asking about illegal activity, for example, well, you need to give them the information they need to make the decision. Do they want to take part? Are they going to get reported to the police? And this brings me to the next point, confidentiality and privacy. People who are being studied, it tends to be good practice to keep their identities secret. You'll remember that the example used by Stacey was Pam Gamma, not her real name. And when we looked at her story and how she talked about what it was to be in a divorce extended family, you can kind of understand why that would be useful. You don't really want the various husbands, boyfriends, and children getting wind of the sorts of deals and financial support and social support that they were offering to one another in the background. The whole point was that it was secretive and it was supportive in that way. So you've got to respect their confidentiality. The second thing you've got to respect is people's privacy. There are some areas that people are less willing to talk about, even though they're willing to talk about others. Going back to the sexuality example, if you're looking for a particular survey on the attitudes to sexuality, then it's important to know what sexuality is having those attitudes, if you catch my drift. But what you don't want to do is pry too much further. So maybe it'd be very interesting to know whether or not they're profligate, i.e. how many sexual partners they've had, but you've got to respect the privacy of the people taking part. You don't really want to pry too far. The information you're looking for isn't dependent on that, and so you've got to take that into consideration. I've not done any sexual surveys. I'm just pointing out that they are a particular area where confidentiality and privacy and informed consent is a big deal. There's also the point of harm. The idea of doing research as sociologists is that you shouldn't really be causing harm with it. So one of the things that sociologists have to take into consideration is the effects of the work that they're doing. If you're looking at gang activity and you're looking at what causes people to join gangs, what you don't want to do is make the situation worse by inadvertently affecting, say, young people by letting them know what gangs there are in their area when they are not already exposed to those gangs. So you don't want to go in with a unstructured interview and open with, here are all the gangs in the local area and where you can find them. Have you met any of them? Do you see what I mean? It's a bit like earlier on when I was mentioning about sexuality surveys and saying I knew of one, and then I realized that if I told you what the name was, you'd all go and find it. That could cause harm. I have to be careful what I say. Equally, surveys into crime or participant observation could lead to police intervention for the people being surveyed or for the researcher themselves. There's career prospects. If you discover someone is a football hooligan, for example, or was a football hooligan, that could affect their career prospects in the future. Or maybe you dig up some social media posts, and we've had some high-profile cases of that over the last year, where people's social media posts in the public domain have affected their career prospects in the future, or they've turned up to far-right demonstrations, been identified on the internet, and lost their job. Some people who looked similar to those people also lost their jobs. You don't always get the right people. Social exclusion. If you, I don't know, going back to the sexuality example, inadvertently out people, well, that can lead to social exclusion within their social circles. If they come from a religious background, for example, and it's a particular form of religious background, let's say the Westboro Baptist Church, and you out someone in the Westboro Baptist Church as gay, That's going to lead to an incredible amount of social exclusion, also probably a lot of attacks. You've got to be careful what you do and how you do it. There's also psychological damage to take into consideration. A lot of the questions we've looked at in families and households, and I'm sure some of the ones you've looked at in education too, are the sorts of questions that are quite deep. And one of the reasons that families and households is so challenging, and we have discussed this, is because it is effective. It is something we look at and we recognize and we find difficult to deal with on an emotional level. It can make us sad. Now think about the people being studied themselves. Remember that girl? She just wishes that everyone would understand how difficult it was to live on no money, how hard it is to wait for food. And you're thinking, what kind of psychological damage is that doing when you're getting her to say that to camera? She's now on TV. She's going to see that in the future. What about people who know her? How are they going to react, and how's that going to affect her future life chances? Do you see what I mean? That leads to the idea of vulnerability. A lot of the groups that sociologists want to know most about are vulnerable groups. And, well, they're people too, you know? So if you go in there crashing around like a bull in a china shop trying to find out what you need to know, you can inadvertently make things worse, or worse, absolutely do it and know you're doing it. So you've got to be careful with the groups you're using, and you've got to tailor your approach to those groups. And this brings me to the last point. What about covert research? What if you go undercover? What if you try to work out what makes football hooligans tick in the 1980s and do so by sneaking in and covertly filming them? Now, you understand you can't just go in there and ask them for informed consent. I would like to know more about football hooligans. You seem to be a football hooligan, so I'm going to study you. It's not going to go down too well. These people are violent and dangerous. Or maybe you want to learn why people get radicalized. Are you going to tell the potential terrorists and the potential ne'er-do-wells that you are a researcher and that you're going to get their informed consent about what you're doing? Well, obviously not. That's really dangerous. So you can argue that they are justifications. Equally, though, if you withhold researcher and or aim of research, you can't get informed consent. And maybe you tell your participants you're doing one thing, but you're actually doing another. And this raises moral questions. You might get interesting data, but is it good data? I don't have the answers for you. I just point out what the potential issues could be. And the final is theoretical. You'll notice that there's no space for me to write issues, so I just went with theoretical. First of all, the theoretical issue is validity. Now, when we talk about validity as a sociologist, we don't necessarily talk about truth. We're not talking about reliability, more about that in a moment. We're talking about, does it show what you want it to show? Does the data do what you need it to do? If you're asking about voting intentions and you're asking in leading questions, for example, or you're asking a particular set of questions, will it give you what you want to know? There was a phenomenon, and I'm afraid I'm going to politics for this, and I do apologize if you're not taking politics, but there was a phenomenon in the late 1980s of shy Tories, people who felt they didn't really want to be identified as Tory voters, but were absolutely Tory voters. And so in poll after poll after poll after poll, people said they wouldn't vote Tory, but then obviously did. It didn't give people the information they required. And part of that was who was asking the questions and what sort of questions were being asked. People felt embarrassed. And so polling companies have had to change and adapt their approach. Secondly, have you learned the truth? Now, hang on, I've got to move my face out of the way. It's not in the way in yours, but it is on mine. Is what you've learned the truth or not? Are people likely to fudge what's going on? We go back to that shy Tory thing again. But also when you're doing, we'll go back to the sexuality surveys, are you getting actual answers? If you're doing an anonymous survey on the internet and you're talking about the number of sexual partners, the propensity for lying is huge. Why wouldn't someone go on the internet and anonymously say they'd had 20 sexual partners? What's to stop them? There's no reason why they should tell the truth, and they're probably doing it with their mates. They'll show off a bit and have a laugh, even if everyone knows they haven't. It's just a joke, right? And then they can go back and do it multiple times. Are you going to get the data you need, or are you going to get something else? Now, arguably, you can use that for a completely different purpose, and it's nothing to do with sexuality at all. It's to do with perceptions of sexuality and who says what. But this is interesting. It's not going to give you the data if you're going in there wanting to know what the average number of sexual partners is for various people at various ages. It's not going to give you that data. Oh, no. Also, is what is revealed deep enough? Is it going to answer all the questions you have? Or is it just a surface scratch, as it were, of what's out there? Is it just a snapshot and no more? Sometimes that's all you want, but the validity of that depends what you're trying to do, I suppose. So validity is how much does the data match what you need to find out to answer the question you've decided to answer. That brings us on to reliability and replicability. Now, in history, and arguably in English, I don't really know, but definitely in history, reliability refers to is the position and trust, is the person giving you the information trustworthy? Is the information itself trustworthy? When we talk about reliability in sociology, we mean it slightly differently. What we mean by reliability in this case is, can you do it again and get the same result? If that is the case, then it's reliable. Now, that's not strictly speaking the meaning of the word reliable. So obviously sociology comes up with its own words and it comes up with replicability. Can you do it again? Is it replicable? Is it repeatable? So for example, take questionnaires versus interviews. If you sent out a series of questionnaires to a cross-section of the population, you receive information about those things, like a census return, for example, you should be able to do it again with the same information in a different cross-section and get a pretty similar result. And the census has over time adapted to that. So we know the census is pretty reliable, is replicable. If you send out a cross-section of any questionnaire and then send out the same questionnaire to another group of people and get wildly different results, then it's not replicable. It's not very reliable. Something is going awry, and you need to look into that and find out why. Interviews are another good way of doing this. If you do the same scripted interview with different people, you've got a series of structured questions, and you end up with roughly similar results depending on wherever you go, then you found a reliable and replicatable result. If you do it in one area, you get one set of results, in another area, you get another set of results, but then you go back to that same area and you get yet another set of results, well, then something's gone wrong and your interview isn't working. Questionnaires arguably are easier to replicate than our interviews. In many cases, the person doing the interview can affect the answers you get. I know of a case of this in education. So at my mad place, if you met me, you know about my mad place. I worked as a teacher and, well, obviously I did. And there was an old behaviour support worker who'd been promoted to head of year. So as a behaviour support worker, the students tended not to lie. If the student did something wrong in a lesson or was misbehaving, they tended to be utterly and brutally honest about it. And if they asked them straight, tell me straight, did you do this? Then the kid would tend to go, yeah, I did actually, fair cop. Because they didn't see a behaviour support worker as a teacher. They weren't part of the system. Those behaviour support workers had nurtured a link with the students whereby the students saw them as being on their side. So they were really useful and they tended to get the truth. And it also meant that they could rely on students to, if they denied something, to have told the truth, and then they could sort of troubleshoot with the staff involved. Now, when this behaviour support worker became a head of a year, what they didn't realise was that they had become part of the system. The kids picked up on it straight away. And so they'd ask them, did you do it? And the kids was like, no. And of course, they were used to kids being honest. So then they go back to the member of staff and berate them for lying. But that wasn't right. It wasn't working. I only say this because I came a cropper of it myself. A student had done, I forget exactly what they'd done. And this head of year came back, so we'll know that they've denied it. I'm like, yeah, but I have evidence. Oh yeah, but I trust the student. That's great, but they don't trust you. You're now part of the system. In other words, the position an interviewer is in is often more important than the personal characteristics of that interviewer. And that can change the results that you get. So reliability. There's also representativeness, i.e. how typical are the responses you're getting. If you're asking a bunch of people found in, say, Ilkeston late at night, a series of questions about what they're doing throughout their day, is it really representative of the entirety of Derbyshire? Or indeed the entirety of Ilkeston? Or even the entirety of Ilkeston late at night, if you see what I mean? So typicality is important. How do you choose your sample? You can't possibly interview everybody in the country or get everybody to take part in a survey or get questionnaires to everybody. And even if you did, you're not going to get them all back. So you need a sample size. You need to understand how to find a sample, a large enough sample that is representative enough to give the answers for the whole of society. That's how opinion polls and most surveys for government work. So when we're looking at, say, compliance rates with COVID controls, then anecdotal evidence, the random people you know about, aren't really going to give you a good sample size. Get a large enough sample size and you can intuit what's happening across the entire population. And the results may be different than what you expect. So you've got to make sure that sample matches that wider population. Does it include the same number or the same proportion of people in difficult circumstances as is in the wider population? Have you got enough women? Have you got enough men? Have you got enough children? Have you got enough people of various ages? Have you got enough people with various backgrounds and so on and so forth? And so choosing your sample is often very important and will yield different results depending on how you choose that sample. Finally, finally, there's the perspective of the surveyor, the perspective of the sociologist undertaking the research. Generally speaking, and simplifying horribly, but this is A-level, so, we'll simplify a bit. But generally speaking, there are two types of sociologists. There are positivists and interpretivists. Generally speaking, there are more, I know. Positivists tend to view sociology as being more scientific, as being a way of predicting human behavior and understanding things on a scientific basis. Sociology as science, as a study of human beings. And to that end, they tend to prefer quantitative data. I guess that makes me a bit of a positivist, because at the end of the day, I do prefer quantitative data. I like my numbers. I like my charts. I like the idea of being scientific. However, I am the world's worst scientist. The second group, interpretivists, believe that, you've got to be more evaluative. You've got to understand what the numbers mean. It's all very well saying divorce is increasing, but what does that mean for the people undertaking divorce, for example? It's all very well saying there's a 20% increase in A grades year on year at A-level, but what does that mean for the people getting the A grades? Do you see what I mean? What does it mean for the people who get Bs? What does it mean for people who fail? And they'd argue that the data itself, that the simple numerical data, doesn't tell you much. Learning what it means and why it's occurring is far more important. And to do that, you've got to interpret the data. Hence, positivists, the data is more important. Interpretivists, you've got to use the data to do something. I'm a bit of both, but mainly I think I'm a positivist at the end of the day. So cards on the table, bias is out in the open. What conclusions can we draw from this? Now, I've used a question mark because, let's be fair, what conclusions can you possibly draw from all of this? Well, there have been studies of sociologists, and they've discovered that basically the perspective, i.e., are you a positivist or interpretivist, of the researcher is arguably more important than most other theoretical considerations, because depending on what you like and what you think is going to yield the results, that's what you're going to use in your research. It makes perfect sense to me. So that, along with the personal skills and characteristics of the researcher, will largely influence what research methods they use. It makes sense, I guess. If you know what you're good at and you know what you're after and you know roughly what you prefer, you're going to do that. Secondly, opportunity versus costs. It tends to be that opportunity outweighs costs, that when sociologists are offered the opportunity to do things, they'll take it. And that will be regardless of the costs, either time, money, or even social standing and social capital. We'll talk more about that later. I'll point it back to you. And finally, requirements versus ethics. When it comes down to it, if you're getting the funding and someone's asking for a particular question answered, that tends to trump the ethics of how you get your consent. So if there's a conflict, sociologists tend to go with requirements over the ethics. That doesn't mean they're unethical. It just means that when you're choosing your method, requirements are more important when you're weighing your methods up than the ethical issues that may result from those choices. So people won't make unethical decisions, they'll just make less ethical decisions than they would without the requirements, if that makes sense. The way to remember this, and I'm sorry, I've already tipped my hand here, is to remember, because like most things in sociology, you'll discover this, we can shorten it. What we have here are pet issues. It's a picture with 17 pets in it. The person who took it has some pet issues. I'll get my comb. So this has been a very bad pun, and also hopefully a good introduction to this new area of the course where we're talking about research methods. It can get rather dry, but as you probably gathered, I like things to be dry, like my void. So yeah, we'll deal with that. I get quite excited about this. I don't know if you can tell, because this sort of thing, well, it's fun. It's observing the observers. Who watches the watchers? Some people get that reference, and some people are well-rounded individuals with no major problems. So anyway, you get the idea. You know where we're heading. We're going to look at different forms of research methods. We'll look at the advantages and disadvantages. I will share video links, because of course I will. And yeah, hopefully this is as exciting to you as it is to me, and genuinely it's quite exciting to me. It's hard to transmit that properly across a camera without a lot, but I'm not a YouTuber, so I can't do that. Anyway, have a lovely rest of day. I hope this has been diverting and interesting. I hope it's been useful. By all means, pop any questions in the comments of the Show My Homework section. There won't be any work required from this one. If you want to share your notes just to make sure that they're done and you want any input, that's fine. There will be a homework attached to this, but I'll do a video about that as well, and I'll attach that at some other point. So when I say it's attached to this, that's a lie. It'll be in the next lesson, and that will be another set of test questions on government policy in families. So that's coming. Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the day. I shall see you in the next video.